Well, thanks so much for having me, everyone. And I'm so excited that I had the opportunity to go after Susan introduce this wonderful idea of narrative and the stories that we tell, the way that narrative is important in making meaning. And I'm going to take off from that and go through from an interdisciplinary perspective how one can pull data together to reveal the story, to continue finding the story and uncovering it in stages. And I'm coming to this from a background that is interdisciplinary. I have a background that's both meteorology and behavioral science. And I spent the last 6 years or so at the National Severe Storms Lab developing the Behavioral Insights Unit, which is a sort of first of its kind social science research team in a NOAA weather lab. And that process was one that was all about forming research questions and connections entirely through finding ways to help physical and social scientists talk together and make meaning of each other's data in the context of one another. And I have to apologize if, while I am finding the story through the talk today, if I lose the story, just know that it's because I came in this morning on that 6 a.m. flight that always sounds so great when you book it, right? You're like, oh, that's gonna be so efficient. I'm gonna have all day and then I'll get home and it's gonna be great. And my 9-month-old decided that mommy was necessary last night for sleeping, and she refused to sleep unless mommy was holding her. So this narrative may have unexpected detours along the way. If I wonder, just please be forgiving. But I'm excited to start with a bit of narrative from the perspective of the field of meteorology, and especially severe weather and the narratives we tell ourselves after events occur. And I'll start with this particular event. I'm going to be unpacking it through narrative today. And this was the Lee County tornado in March of 2019. And after events like this happen, this one was particularly lethal. Questions always arise, and especially the question, how could we have done better? We berate ourselves. Meteorologists, we sort of see ourselves as, because we can predict something about the future, it's kind of on us to save everyone, and we put that on ourselves. And so there's this systematic process we go through of reckoning with each event. And one of the first things that I see go on in the reckoning is an analysis of the forecast. And it is almost invariably the case that the forecast was great. So then, everyone looks at things like, well, but there was this incredible, mesoscale discussion that SPC just invented. It was the first one they'd ever issued, and it highlighted Lee County, Alabama. And they had that out an hour or two ahead of time. How could people not have all immediately just known that and known how to respond to it? But there's all of this detail that we put into our forecast and the message that we think we're conveying in the story we think we're telling. And then people like Steven Strader, my buddy sitting over there in the red shirt, come along, the people who like to bring us the happy piece of the story, nothing but the joy. And he had put together this incredible data set of the location of every mobile and manufactured home in the state of Alabama. And because he had that available, when this event happened, he was immediately able to ascertain how likely it was that those structures were actually almost entirely mobile and manufactured homes, and that this event was driven by that vulnerability. So that came into our public consciousness. Oh, it's vulnerable people. And then we conclude the narrative this way. I'll just say it's really deep, dark fatalism. We just go into this hole of, here's the New York Times byline, in a place with widespread poverty and few places to hide, it could not save everyone, the warning. And another from Dennis Mercereau, a human being simply cannot survive that kind of storm without being underground or deep within a much stronger structure. And we tell ourselves these stories about the unsurvivability of tornadoes, and we tell people who are vulnerable these stories then. they're hearing these stories from us about the precariousness and hopelessness of their situation. And so I want to follow the data. I want to unpack this a little bit and ask, is there really nothing that can be done? And I'll start by taking us to a fairly basic question. Well, do we have evidence that improvements in the warning system are having an impact on tornado fatalities? Let's start big picture. One way that you can look at this is over the course of time. And this is a great figure I love from Dr. Harold Brooks at NSSL, where he has normalized tornado fatalities by the US population. So this can be understood as the number of people who die per year in the United States as a function of population, so normalized. And what you see is starting around 1925, for reasons Harold and I aren't completely clear about. We've had a lot of conversations about this. But 1925 was before there were tornado forecasts of any kind. That started in 1948. And the Weather Service was still not the Weather Service, it was the Weather Bureau. But what we did have was the advent and spread of radio and the capacity for people to tell each other stories about tornadoes and weather systems as they moved across the country. And we think that might have something remarkable to do with this. But over time, what you see is the fatality rate goes down by at least an order of magnitude over time. So there's one story we can tell that's successful. And that is we are doing something, at least by sharing stories about the hazard. It's probably something that's having an effect. But let's take a deeper look and look at another layer of this story, another chapter. What I'm showing you is that population broken into two groups. The black squares are people who live in mobile and manufactured homes and their fatality rate as a share of their population. And the white squares are people who live in permanent housing. And what you see from this is a new story, a new understanding of what's going on. And the way I understand this story is that for people who live in mobile and manufactured homes, it's almost as though there's not been a warning system at all. Their fatality rate is about the same as before there was any really great way of distributing and making stories about tornado information. And so we ask ourselves from this, okay, where can we move forward from here, from this understanding, from this story? And I go to the broader literature on tornado epidemiology to try to pull more context. Let's get some more of the story. What does it take to get to be safe from a tornado? What do people really need to do? If people in manufactured homes are that poorly off, does it take a FEMA-rated shelter? Do we need community shelters everywhere? Is that the only thing that can save them? And what we find when we look at the epidemiological evidence, and by that I mean we count not just the deaths, but the number of survivors, or at least an estimate of exposure. So we can reveal the fatality rate. And when we do that, even in the worst tornadoes that have occurred in the last couple decades, repeatedly we see a survival rate of over 99%. How many people in this room knew that tornadoes were that survivable? And that's just the worst ones. Yeah, almost none of us know this story. And what's interesting about that is we are in a position of communicating risk information to support decision-making by our populations. And we ourselves aren't taught these things. We're taught the physics, we're taught the modeling, we're taught that part of the data, but we're not taught about the consequences and about the options for safety in helping people navigate risk decisions. And something that's really important about this, and I'm going to take a quick detour, this one planned, to talk a little bit about a model that can help us understand just how important this piece of information may be. It's called the extended parallel process model, and it's just so named because there are sort of two kinds of things that we're processing when we're responding to a potential threat. And one is that we're appraising the threat itself. So we're looking at how likely is it to exist? Will there actually be a tornado? Is it going to hit me? Trying to personalize it in space, that whole thing. And then there's the coping appraisal, which is what actions will help me? And can I take those actions? And it turns out that the theory suggests that if these two things act in concert with each other. If there's high threat appraisal and high coping appraisal, people will be motivated to act to control the danger. So they'll do things like seek shelter, or at least plan for it, and be attentive, and do all those things that we do observe in many events people do. There are, though, some people who are in a less favorable position, where maybe they have a high threat appraisal, they hear you, tornado's coming, tornado's bad, but they don't have that response efficacy. They don't feel like there's anything they can do, or they don't know what to do. They don't know there even should be something they should be doing. This is some work Stephen and his research team did. People in mobile manufactured homes don't necessarily even know the precariousness of their situation. Even if they do, they don't know how good the trade-offs are in getting to something else. And so the people in this situation often act to control the fear. And that is emotion-focused coping. And then you can get a situation where people are just so afraid that they're stuck in a cycle of fear and they just kind of do nothing. And these people you often see with sort of post-traumatic stress disorder syndrome symptoms after an event occurs. And I'll say, coming from Oklahoma, this has increasingly come to represent that population with respect to tornadoes. Something has been fundamentally going on in that state and changing for about 15 years. And you see it in differences over time in how people are responding. I had a postdoc who looked at evacuation. We have a paper on trying to discern evacuation in tornado warnings. And you can see it in Oklahoma over time as people start to flee more and more around 2010 and 2011. And we start to see people do things like try to break into banks to seek shelter, flood hospitals who have no capacity to handle them. They're just terrified. And there's messaging that goes on that if you're not underground, you won't survive. The stories we tell are materially important to the kinds of decisions people make and what they're motivated to do. So turning back to Lee County, I wanted to go there as part actually of a project with Stephen, and I was really interested in trying to figure out, okay, where should I sample from to understand this event better? And bringing a framework from communication geography, there's a framework we understand in the field of meteorology about the integrated warning team, integrated weather team, where you have the National Weather Service and their core partners like emergency managers and broadcasters who are all messaging to populations at risk. And I wanted to ask a fundamental question. Is anyone taking it upon themselves to message to this population? If so, what are they trying to do? Where are the practices? Are things aligning or are they not? And so the first thing I went to do, it doesn't have to be sophisticated. I used for this is Arcgis online, free software, easy to pull layers. And if you haven't used it in the past, it's so powerful and so easy to just put things together and situate yourself within an event. So I pulled the storm reports from the SPC, from the tornado outbreak, and then I pair that with the communication geography of the region. What you see in the black-lined areas are the county warning areas of the National Weather Service, and the purple lines are media markets, DMAs. And the shading of the counties is the fraction of the housing stock that's mobile and manufactured housing. And while there are some counties, like Lee County is actually right here where you see Auburn, that's Lee County. There are some counties that maybe aren't shaded, but it's because they're more populous, but they still might have a large number of absolute number of mobile homes. But I put this up to show that one of the things that I saw was that these media markets are in an area serving populations where they have a lot of people in mobile homes, a lot. And so I wanted to draw from the various media markets that might have been covering things this day to understand what they were trying to convey. And I also sampled from counties that were more and less well-resourced, and this mapping process is essential when you're trying to do a case study. So it's a really great way to just put everything together and start to get a sense for the story before you go into the field to learn the details. You might get a sense for some of the stuff might be important, and I'm going to sample in such a way that I can strategically get these different pieces of narrative. So really quickly, I will say, what I found out of this, I think if you're curious, what I found out of this was that within each group that I studied, there were individuals who were trying to reach these populations in different ways between the weather service forecast offices, broadcasters, and emergency managers. But there were also individuals in all of those groups who did not think that that was their job, in part because they didn't want to provide inequitable service, which is an interesting way to frame it. But there were people who said, well, I'm a communicator one to many. I have to serve everyone. Interesting framing of equity, but that was the way that they couched it. So out of that, we did kind of see that within the integrated warning team structure, there isn't coherence. There isn't a coherent story about who should be doing what and how that should all come together to serve the needs of this population. But I also wondered out of this event, and as my team grew and we were doing more of these case studies in the field, I wondered more about this communication geography piece and whether there were places where it became challenging. Were there places where people were less well served? I will point out that in this study, I couldn't help but notice that a lot of the counties that were the poorest were the ones that were furthest from the forecast office. And that was disturbing. And I also found when I talked with the forecast office folks that those were the hardest places to conduct outreach in because they couldn't get there. They had poorer relationships with those emergency managers. They held their IWT meetings, though, in the big city that they were located in. And so they didn't get those partners coming up, and those relationships weren't formed. So distance matters. Distance is a commodity that matters to the integrated warning team. So I wanted to explore this further, and we got our opportunity as a team in November 4th, 2022, last fall. I actually intentionally made this map very difficult to discern, but there was an event that happened then. Does anyone know where this is? Can you tell just by the communication geography? It is so different to see things this way, but this is what the communication system of our integrated warning team looks like. Those blue dots are the tornado reports. The red are the media market lines, and the black are forecast office boundaries. And what you see is there are 5 forecast offices converging in one area, and there are at least that many media markets. And question, how in the world was this event covered? Did these people get these warnings? And how in the world did that work? We were especially interested in going, so this is actually Southeast Oklahoma, right in the center here. This is McCurtain County that I'm highlighting with the arrow. This is where Idabel is. This was the Idabel tornado day. And Idabel's right here. And so we sampled across this area. It's a very small area. We went along these 2 tornado paths down into Texas and across Oklahoma and then around Durant. There was the early part of the day, these were the first tornadoes, was Durant. And what we found was this communication geography is incredibly material. The people of McCurtain County don't feel like they're even part of Oklahoma. And there was one person who came to talk with us who he had saved for 10 years pictures on his phone from every time that McCurtain County wasn't included in a severe thunderstorm watch or a winter storm watch or anything else, but all the surrounding counties were, which led us to do our own study where we parsed apart for different counties, how often are they included when their boundary counties are included, like just sort of get a measure of, is this actually an effect? And we found that was indeed an effect, and that's part of the bigger communication system of the National Weather Service. It's all about collaboration between the national centers and the local offices. Because of that geographic quirk, McCurtain County gets left out all the time because they don't want to bring in the Shreveport forecast office and the collaboration for stuff. And that is getting noticed by people in McCurtain County. And they suffered disproportionately from a number of other issues in the communication ecosystem. So all of that, what we found, and our drive to sample from these areas was driven by just putting some of these pieces of data together in creative ways and understanding that there is this system and then just investigating it and looking for theory to guide us to places where there might be these issues, and then seeing if that story actually is manifesting on the ground. So I'm going to take that back a step now and bring us out to the geography of the whole National Weather Service. There's a communication geographer, Paul Adams, who has theorized a good bit about communication infrastructure, especially as we create all of these virtual spaces that we inhabit. It's easy to forget that communication infrastructure exists in place, but it does. And there's a couple different dimensions to that that have geopolitical significance. One is if you're nearer to those resources, you very often receive the benefit of you have better service. You have more power in the situation. You're more empowered probably to handle whatever it is the communication system is there to help you to do. And so let's look at this weather service map. After the 2019 tornado, and I went to the southeast, and I was kind of disturbed by that reckoning of there's some people who are farther away from the Weather Service forecast offices than others. I tried to find any literature I could to talk about why the forecast offices were put where they were. And I tried to reach out to Weather Service personnel who'd been part of it at the time, and all that I got was people sort of saying, well, we balanced radar coverage and just trying to have a city where people could live in and population density. That was the furthest that they got to talking about it. And I think that that's an interesting way for us to have created this system, especially as now we're thinking about service equity in the Weather Service and thinking, in the short run, we're trying to just think about it as quick hits. But in the long run, as a trained decision scientist economist, everything is changeable. So I think it's important to still think about our infrastructure and how we might change and evolve in the long run. So here are a couple of ways we can look at the story of, from the eyes of our publics, who is being served, who might not be being served, in what places might be interesting to investigate, just looking at the story through different eyes. And indeed, there does seem to be a strong correspondence between the location of forecast offices and the space they cover and population density. There also is some, when you put this map up against the forecast office map, this is a map of transportation connectivity. So it gives us a suggestion of places that have relationship, economic relationship, social relationship. Those boundaries cross state lines. They cross, all kinds of different lines. This is regional geographers study sort of how we arrange ourselves and relate to each other. And that's an interesting way to think about, can we break our system apart by subregions of similarity? That could be a way to foster some equity. There are some general relationships to some of this framing. But how about for people who live in mobile and manufactured housing? It starts to break down. There are definitely places where there's a high density of these individuals, where even there are tornadoes as well. And they are much farther from those resources. And taking this a step further, we'll look at poverty and ask ourselves the same question. And I think the more that you look at these maps and the National Weather Service boundary map, the more that you can draw out places where there is social distance between our system and different ways of being vulnerable to hazards. An interesting one, I will touch the third rail here. There's a strong correspondence between the poverty and race and ethnicity in our country, and especially in the Southeast. That area of purple is high density Black people, and that was the so-called Black Belt. And it has suffered systemic discrimination for centuries. So when we look at where we cited our forecast offices and how far the people in that particular area are from those, I think we can prioritize some of the most egregious disparities that may exist and ways we've reinforced them unintentionally or intentionally, but we have. I know this is a little bit difficult to see, but there's another story to be told based on ethnicity and language. This is the fraction of the population that is Hispanic. And so these people might have very different kinds of systems. And actually, when we've done our field work, we have an immigrant on the research team and a native Spanish speaker. And he has found that everywhere we've gone, there's a completely separate, there's a white culture of getting weather information, and there's an immigrant culture of getting weather information, and they are completely different. And the result is that people who are immigrants often find out about weather events that are coming much later than the white population. They have much less time to prepare. And part of the challenge is language, but part of the challenge is also that they are migrants. They come from places with a different hazard story, different disaster subculture, and different communication systems that they're adapted to. They aren't adapted to ours. So they might not even know that tornadoes are a thing and that it's something that they need to pay attention to until they're dealing with them. So these are the kinds of stories that are important to understand if we want to improve service equity. We have to see our structure through the eyes of the different populations in our country. I'm going to go ahead and wrap this up to say, when you're making the story, I know I'm a geographer. My PhD is in geography. And so I like maps, but I think that they also serve an important purpose in this space. And I think when it comes to weather and social science and policy, we should always look to take things to the map. We can combine different kinds of data like hazard information or hazard climatology with the communication infrastructure, understand that where things are in that infrastructure is material to the way people get weather information as a resource that's locally tailored, or just outreach and everything that's associated with that. That social capital piece of the IWT is fostered through physical distance as much as conceptual social distance. The demographics of the populations, it's important to just see how that's arranged. Anything in the problem space that can help you situate the story is really good to take to a map. And it doesn't have to be a fancy thing. All of what I showed you was stuff that was easily accessible in Arc Online. So I don't know if all of you have in the past worked with GIS, but don't be afraid of it. Just go and play with data. And if you want to come to my group later, we're going to explore this topic a little bit further and do exactly that, play with maps and data. So with that, I have no idea what time it is, and I will conclude and let you guys ask any questions.
Thank you for that fantastic talk, especially on so little sleep. I honestly forgot that you were tired. Energy is great, information is great. We have time for a question before we go to the break, but I also want to go ahead and replug what she mentioned about having a breakout group later for storytelling with maps. That looks pretty awesome.
So I know you were mentioning those insights from like that one county that's sort of been left out. Has there been any communication kind of from like the National Weather Service or like any action after that fact about like how to improve that, or like improvements in communications between offices and stuff like that?
I'm hoping it'll come. We have a paper that we're about ready to submit where we developed a methodology for looking at how many McCurtain counties might there be, where might they be. And while we aren't going to all those places, it at least suggests places that might need special focus and attention by local forecast offices, additional outreach, or at least just to investigate what the situation on the ground is, to make sure that as much as the Weather Service can, as much as we play that role, but to make sure that service is as equitable as possible. So I would hope that once the paper is out, that it would help to drive some of these local IWT conversations and all of that. Thank you.